We're Brianna and Keely, and you're listening to the Where We Live podcast, where we discuss all things home.
You'll hear from us on residential real estate, the process of buying and selling a home, design trends, entrepreneurship, faith, and much more.
In this episode, we have a conversation with Katie Hill, an experienced Airbnb host that is now also a traditional landlord. If you've considered buying rental property or trying to make income on a property you already own, we know you will love this episode.
Katie is dynamic and honest and will guide us through the pros and cons of what it means to have tenants, both temporary and long-term. Being a landlord isn't for the faint of heart, but it can make some great income. So let's get into it.
Well, welcome, Katie. We're so glad you're here.
Thanks, guys, for
welcome.
having me. Excited to be here.
Okay, so a little bit of background. Katie and I had the privilege of knowing Katie all the way back at SMU in college, and then have had the privilege of getting to be their realtor as they have built their real estate empire. And I just think people are really going to benefit from your story, especially because I think people, after they've kind of bought their first home, the idea of rental income is very interesting, and how to do it is pretty intimidating to a lot of people. So would you tell us a little bit currently about your rental portfolio and kind of your history with Airbnb and traditional rentals?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's basically how we got into it. We bought our first house and kind of decided it wasn't not what we expected, but we kind of were looking for maybe a move or doing something different. And so I just posted our house on Airbnb while we were still living there just to see if we'd get any bites. Sure enough, the first person that wanted it for 3 months. So we could have obviously said no, but we're like, hey, this might be the perfect opportunity. So we spent a weekend getting it ready to go, and then ended up buying another place that we moved into intentionally to set it up as an Airbnb, which we can get into more details on that. But at this point, we have basically that house in Lake Highlands, and then another condo down in Uptown, and then we're just starting down in South Dallas. So it's kind of been an evolution, and I think that first one's the hardest, just getting going and getting comfortable with renting. But it's a nice way to kind of get a feel for the market if there's interest. And for us, there really was. And so we ran with it.
And so now you actually, both of those homes are under traditional lease. And so I think that'll be good to hear the contrast of all of that.
For sure. I don't know if we would have gone that route necessarily, but the pandemic kind of forced us there. That's one thing about Airbnb. It's not guaranteed. So with that comes highs. You know, you can actually make a lot more per month, but at the same time, it's not guaranteed. So we decided to go a little safer route. And with the rental market in Dallas being pretty crazy, we were able to make some good money just going long term for now.
That brings us actually right to our next question for you, focusing on Airbnb first, because that's where you started. What would you say to our listeners? What are the pros and the cons of Airbnb?
So pros, obviously, financial. I think you can make more money, especially if you've done your research. And we've had mortgages on ours, so we're having to make payments every month, and we've been able to make more by doing Airbnb. But also you have to be kind of risk tolerant because you never quite know what you're going to have each month. I think the other big challenge is you have to have someone in cleaning. So finding good cleaners that you can trust, that I guess would be more of a con because you never quite know if they're going to be there. We've had good luck, but at the same time, there's been situations that have been a little difficult to manage of, you're wanting to compensate them if someone's not there or having to make last minute trips and clean. So that's been more difficult from the management perspective. But I've also really enjoyed Airbnb because you get to know people coming from different places. And I love Dallas, so it's been really fun to share that with them. It's kind of more of a business, I feel like. So it gives you that ownership and aspect of it versus just the long term where it's just kind of you let it go. The last thing I'll say about it is it can be expensive.
Do you have a formula when you're thinking? You go ahead, say that again, and I'll ask the question after.
Oh, you're fine. I was just saying, the initial setup can be a little bit cumbersome at the beginning. So we had a place that we'd already been living in, so it took us a little bit to get it set up. But I would say that's probably easier than going from nothing and having to furnish a place completely. And I think sometimes people forget that aspect, that even if you're doing it cheap, it adds up. But you also want it to be homey and comfortable. And we found it to be really beneficial to have lived in the places before, even if you did it for a few nights, just to say, oh, what am I missing? Or what's going to be frustrating for a tenant or a guest? So just the initial setup, you want to put some thought into it.
Yeah, because that's one of the biggest differences between, to recap, because we didn't flat out say that, one of the biggest differences between having an Airbnb versus a longer term traditional rental home is that it has to be fully furnished. These people are coming just with their suitcase, whether it's for a night or 3 months. They just have their suitcase. So I really like the idea of you sleeping in there for a few nights, pretending to be an Airbnb tenant. To make your list and make sure you've got it all full. That kind of sounds like fun.
It kind of is. But I think it's so important, especially like the kitchen and things. A lot of times we have cooks in there. They're here to visit their grandkids in the neighborhood, or a lot of people we found were renovating their home, so they needed somewhere else to live. So they are expecting to cook meals every night and spend a lot of time there. And that, I think, depends the neighborhood you're doing Airbnb, the type of guests you're going to have.
Yeah. Is there a magic formula to calculating like percent occupancy? Does Airbnb give you any guidance in that? Or how can you decide, do I think this is going to be profitable?
So what we've done is we kind of look at different properties and investing in more Airbnbs is honestly go on Airbnb's website and do a quick search in the neighborhood you're looking, see how many places are on the market. Because if it's oversaturated, that can be difficult, but also what they're listing them for, and not just what price they hope to get per night, but are they filled up? So we'll click on the calendar and look through the next 3 months. And if it's prime season and they're pretty much empty, then it probably isn't the right move, even if they're optimistic on how much they can get per night. But that being said, there's not really a formula as far as if it's going to go. You kind of have to go with your gut, and a little research does go a long way. And then as far as setting the price and then kind of occupancy and all of that, once you're in Airbnb, they really are amazing at all the data. So they take information from the whole neighborhood and they actually suggest what price to list your house at. You can kind of give a range and they'll update it automatically even based on high seasons and during the week and everything. And then at the end of the year, they'll give you how much you made, how many days you had vacant, what your income was from cleaning fees and all of that. So after a year, you'd really have a really good idea of kind of what the next ones could look like.
So I know you've had suburb houses, kind of like in the middle of suburban neighborhoods, and then you've had more walkable type properties. I mean, do you think one or the other is more valuable, or do you just do the same calculation?
I think it really depends what you're going for. I tend to prefer longer term stays, which I found to happen a lot more in the suburbs. People are renovating or visiting families, so they'll come for weeks at a time, which is really nice because you're not having to worry about turning it over as often. But you also don't get access to it as much. So if someone's there for 3 months, you never quite know what's happening to the property. So getting in every 3 days, our properties have been left in really great condition because even more than me staying somewhere, I'm not cleaning the shower every 3 days. So it doesn't stay in nice condition. But the thing about urban areas that I would consider for sure is if it's part of a multifamily property or an apartment, there's going to be HOA regulations. You'll have more neighbors to worry about. Noise complaints could be an issue. So we had to be a lot more conscious of that with our more urban property, is getting approval before we even bought the place to make sure that we could rent it. They tend to be more accepting of long-term rentals, but you would still probably need to have it approved by the HOA. There's also restrictions on how many places can be tenant occupied versus owner occupied. And so I think you can run that risk. Even if it's super profitable, more people want to come in and rent, they might stop allowing it. So you're kind of at the mercy of the HOA versus more of a suburban place where it's your property and really you can do what you want. Obviously, you'd want to look into the local regulations. But thankfully in Dallas, we haven't had any issues with that so far.
What about you touched a little bit now about the long-term leases, a little bit about the differences. But before we get into comparing the two side by side, let's switch gears to the traditional lease. Traditional meaning longer term, right? You're not allowing people to come in and rent for a couple of nights. This is usually a 12-month lease at a time, maybe longer, maybe a little bit shorter. But the house is not furnished. It's just traditional, what you would think of renting a house. Walk us through some of the pros and cons of a traditional lease.
Pro for sure is just it's more hands off. So especially if you're working a full-time job and don't really have the time to make sure someone's cleaning it every 3 days, it's great for that. And you can build a nice relationship with one person and kind of check in and make sure they're taking good care of it. It's consistent income. So each month you know exactly what you're going to make. But kind of alongside that is a con. So Airbnb, you can almost always have something coming in each month, even if it's lower. Whereas if you have a tenant move out, we've been lucky, and Keely's helped us rent our places out really quickly, so we haven't had down months, but that's a risk. Suddenly it takes you 4 months to fill a place. You're just having to carry that expense versus making up for some. Pro is you don't have to worry about, lawn care or electricity or cable. That's the tenant's responsibility, versus there's just a lot more things that you could be responsible for with an Airbnb to take care of. Colin, I touched on this before with longer term Airbnb rentals, is they're in the house for potentially years at a time. That's best case that they stay, but you never quite know if some maintenance issues could go unnoticed. So then at the end, you have some bigger expenses if there was an issue with, water leaking or roofing. And one thing I found with that is if you have a good relationship with your tenant, they call you. I mean, thankfully, anytime there's been something, they've let me know and I can take care of it. And I think some of that is they're concerned about their deposit and they want that back. But they also understand that that's my investment, and they want to make sure that I have a chance to get in there and take a look. So,
how did you go from, especially, I think, it having been your home before? So you lived in these places and then you rented them out. I mean, did you have emotional ties to it? Was it difficult to see somebody living in there? Because I do think a lot of people think about renting their homes when they move, right? They're like, should I keep this property and become a landlord? I would say that that's pretty common. And so how do you get over kind of that emotional tie? And is there one?
You definitely have to be intentional about it. And I have found that when I first started Airbnb being our first home that we ever owned, I was doing the cleanings just because I had the time and it was the way to have access and make sure everything was perfectly set up. And instead of having to pay the cleaning fee, I got to take that as profit as well. But there were definitely times where I'd come away just very frustrated that they moved something, or I could just tell they didn't clean it up as much as I thought they should. And really, thankfully, none of it was a big deal at all. With a nice clean, it was totally fine. But I did find myself kind of getting resentful about it. So I found, and if you can have a cleaner come in, even first, and you can still come check it out. It's probably a good idea if you find yourself having those feelings. But I will say it's gotten better over time. That was our first place. Now, as we've done it more and more, I just am more comfortable with, I see how we, live in a place. Sometimes we do move things around and make it comfortable and make it home.
Any nightmare stories, or any tips for choosing a good tenant?
Yeah, really no nightmare stories. Like we had somebody wet the bed and not tell us. Like that's kind of the extent, or leave it pretty dirty, but nothing too bad. And I think some of that is the location we've chosen, that you just don't get people for their bachelor weekends or bachelorette parties. And some of that you just have a bigger deposit and you're comfortable with any sort of updates you have to do. And then as far as tenants, I think if you're looking for a long-term rental, combination of it depends on the neighborhood and the type of tenants you're looking at. Price it well so that you get enough interest that you don't just have one person, all your eggs aren't in one basket. Like we've been lucky enough to have multiple applications for our properties, so we can kind of choose the one that maybe doesn't have a pet, or is a single person instead of a family of 5. And I'm a family of 5 and we're fine, but I know we destroy a place a lot faster than a single guy who's away at work all the time. So some of that comes with just having the option to choose.
Okay, so one of the biggest questions that I have, and so I'm assuming there's others wondering this, especially talking to somebody that has done both Airbnb and traditional leases, more long-term rentals. Somebody is considering purchasing a home for investment purposes, or like Keely said, they're moving to another home and keeping the home that they did live in. And they're making that decision, should I do this with the intent of Airbnb, or should I do this with the intent of a traditional lease? Mm-hmm. How would you guide them in making that decision and deciding, I don't know if it's property to property is how they should decide that, or if it's them and their own personality, what they can handle to help decide that. What kind of guidance would you give?
I would say it'd be more based on your personality and what you envision and how much time you want to spend on this. If it's purely financial and you just want to have the option to have a property appreciate and hold on to it, then I'd say definitely go the long term. I like the fast paced kind of challenges that it brings, and I like working with people. So for me, the Airbnb is appealing, and I would say I'm pretty risk tolerant. So the idea that I could on a big weekend rent it out for a big game or something and make more, that's appealing to me. But I'm okay with the opposite of it not being rented out. Because what I found is the neighborhood isn't as big of a deal. As far as Airbnb, because somewhere where there's more properties, if you're doing it well and you're setting yourself apart, there's obviously demand. But then also on the flip side, if you're looking at a neighborhood that doesn't have many hotels, that's also really appealing because families that come to town, they'd rather have a place to cook a meal and they're spending longer time. Then you can, capitalize on that by doing that. But I would say make sure you're okay with getting that phone call at midnight with an issue from an Airbnb guest whose place wasn't cleaned or they locked themselves out, because that's a lot more likely to happen on the short terms than a long-term tenant who's there for the long haul.
So in summary, Airbnb is far more hands-on, takes a lot more of your own personal time, but also can come with higher financial rewards. Possibly. Yeah. That's a risk you take on.
For sure.
Where a traditional is a lot more hands-off. You may not be able to capitalize on big events like a game in town, but it is more guaranteed steady income with maybe most likely smaller rewards, but still consistent rewards.
I think one thing to keep in mind is it depends where you're buying, like how the appreciation is looking. If you're looking to hold on to a house for a long time because you think it's going to grow in value, then take the long-term lease and let someone pay down that equity and let it appreciate. If you're looking to make $1,000 each month on top of your mortgage for a couple of years and then decide what to do with it, Airbnb would be the way to go, especially in a neighborhood or an area that's just not appreciating the same. That's how you make the income.
I like that.
So if someone's sold on being a landlord, right? They've listened to this and they're like, okay, I think I'm not as ready for the hands-on. But the question would be, how much am I expected to do as a landlord? How have you found that? Because I know you don't use a property management company. You do it yourself. How involved has that been? What kind of hours have you found the repairs to be? Can you give us a little insight on that as well?
Yeah, I feel like it kind of comes in waves. I'll go 6 months where I don't really hear from my tenant or nothing's going on, and then a week goes by where I'm pretty involved. I think the number one thing if you're going to do it yourself is you need to have a preferred contractor list and probably a general contractor, someone you can call if there's an issue that you can trust to get there relatively quickly. Because I found that to be more stressful at the beginning, was just not really knowing, okay, I need a plumber to come, but I don't really know who to call. So once you have that, it's a lot less time because you're just making a quick call instead of doing that research yourself. And then other than that, I've been pretty hands-off. I haven't wanted to handle the lawn care, the maintenance, and coordinating that, and thankfully no one's really been concerned about it. So that's just one area that I can take off my plate and put on theirs. So I wouldn't say it's tons of time, really. And I think in the long run, I like having the insight to the property versus paying a property management company if there aren't any issues. And if there are, then I probably want to be the one to make the choice of who we're going to use and how we get that handled to maintain that good relationship with the tenant, so they stay longer.
That's great. Anything else that you feel like people should know as they're thinking about this?
I think we've covered it. I wouldn't underestimate the work that goes into an Airbnb, but it is a lot of fun. Like, I don't want to discourage people from doing it, but I would say if you're curious, if you have the option, start with your house that you live in. Take a weekend. You'll feel great about decluttering anyway. Take some pictures and put it online and see if you get any bites. And if you do, then how you feel coming home after having someone stay. Like, I wouldn't just jump right in if you have any chance to test it out. That's what I did. I loved it. And we did it for 3 years with that house before we stopped. And same with being a landlord, it is a little more work, but at the same time, if you're willing to be patient, I think it's worthwhile to jump in there too.
I feel like before we completely wrap up, you just brought up a whole new idea to me and a really good point of if you're not sure of this and you've never done this before, don't necessarily go buy a whole new house just to do this. Try with the house you live in, assuming you don't have restrictions, like you're in a condo or something. Assuming you don't have those restrictions, try it out. Actually, my first clients that did a lot of Airbnb that we did another Airbnb interview with, they just Airbnb'd their primary house, and they would go visit San Diego or whatever. They'd go on a weekend getaway when their house was rented and it paid for their travel.
Exactly.
So that makes the barrier to entry far, far lower. And the point that Keely brought up too of, hey, we're moving, or we're going to buy a new house anyway. Well, you can always try to rent out that house. And if you end up saying, hey, that's not for me, then sell it.
Exactly.
Because you were going to move anyway. You don't have to necessarily buy a brand new property just just to try this out.
Exactly.
And then if you love it, sure, then go buy another property.
Yeah, exactly. Because I do think setting a new one up is cumbersome. So like you have to be ready for that too.
Yeah.
But like if you can make, some good money and go somewhere, especially if you have the option. We have family that don't live here. So it's easy too. Like we could rent it out for a weekend and go stay for free and helps offset the mortgage too. So there's win-win in that sense.
You mentioned the pandemic, and I think I'd be remiss, like, if people at this moment in time, right, are listening to this and wondering what's going on. Do you have an outlook on, like, if you'll change things back to Airbnbs in the future? Is there a timeline in mind on that? Like, any thoughts on that for people that are right now considering this?
And that's hard to say because obviously it changes on a dime. Because I think, 6 months ago, maybe more than that, people weren't traveling. Whereas now I'm planning a trip in a few weeks and I booked it months ago, which is uncharacteristic for me. Usually I do it last minute, but things are booking up because I think everyone wants to travel. So I think people are always going to have that desire, and Airbnb is only getting more popular. Our demographic, like we like to experience a city and also want kind of our own space instead of just staying in a corporate hotel. So I don't see it going away, but I do think you have to be willing to ride out the waves. So if you start now and who knows what's going to happen in the next 6 months, you've got to be able to hold on to the property and make that shift at that point to rent it out long term, or be able to float some months until things pick back up.
I think that's good advice. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This episode, is going to be so helpful to many. And so we just appreciate you as a friend, as a client, and for now as a podcast guest.
Yes, we're super grateful for you taking the time to spend with us and our listeners.
Of course, it's been fun to talk to both of you.
Well, that was fun. When embarking on any financial endeavor, it's useful to hear from someone that has seen it all. We hope today's episode gave you food for thought on your future plans. If you're ready to become a real estate investor, reach out to us. We would love to help.
Many thanks to Katie for her time today. If you're interested in more firsthand stories on how to rent out your home, go back and listen to episode 3, House Hacking to Financial Freedom, and episode 24, Making Money with Airbnb. Also, head to wherewelivepodcast.com to download our free checklist on how to make money with Airbnb.
That wraps up another episode of the Where We Live podcast. We want to hear which topics interest you most for our upcoming shows.
Head on over to wherewelivepodcast.com to continue the conversation in our Facebook group, read our blog, and connect with us. Thanks for tuning in.